Yesterday, the Democrats put out an entirely inadequate piece of legislation in response to the massive protest against police brutality in this country, and they did it in the most clownish way you can possibly imagine. Before I get into the substance of the policy, let me first start by laying out exactly how they did this. So, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, other Democratic members of the House and the Senate joined in this goofy-ass publicity stunt where they wore Kent cloth, which is this African garb, around their neck, and kneeled for 9 minutes, the amount of time that Officer Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck. And if that wasn't pandering and condescending enough, they did this publicity stunt in Emancipation Hall in Congress, which was named after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the Declaration to Free the Slaves. And this is something that Congress, people in Congress, presidents from time to time do this, where they just make this whole big theatrical dog and pony show filled to the brim with identity politics and pandering whenever they introduce a piece of legislation. And I've always found it weird and annoying, and like the only people that appeals to are these ultra woke white liberals in mainstream media who prioritize identity politics above everything else. Those are the only people that this shit ever resonates with. Like, I guarantee you, there is no regular black person out in the country who saw the Democrats put on that dumbass show wearing African garb and kneeling in Emancipation Hall in Congress and thought, wow, these people out there really representing me. Look at them repping all this black culture. Like, nobody out there was impressed by that except for the people in mainstream media who ate that shit up and like, oh my God, look at the Democrats. So in tune with black culture, and they're wearing African garb and they're kneeling in protest and in Emancipation Hall as they're introducing legislation to help with police brutality in this country. Aren't they so woke? Those are the only people who eat that shit up. But I digress from that. Let me get into the policy of this bill, which almost as insulting, probably even more insulting than the whole woke blackness charade that they put on in Emancipation Hall when they were introducing this bill. Okay, so the headline, the top thing, the big ticket item in this piece of legislation that they were bragging about was in all the headlines. That's the main topic of discussion. Apparently, this is supposed to be the biggest thing in the legislation. A federal ban on chokeholds. Really? Banning chokeholds will do almost nothing to curb police brutality in this country. When the NYPD choked out Eric Garner in broad daylight for selling loose cigarettes on the streets of New York, chokeholds were banned by the NYPD, and that didn't stop them, and there were no repercussions, no consequences for those police officers using a banned chokehold. The NYPD didn't even fire the officer. He was on the job for over a year. And still to this date, there was no prosecution. So the idea that a federal ban on chokeholds, oh, yep, they've done it now. They're really going to protect black people from these out-of-control maniac cops on the street because they ban chokeholds on a national level. Like, and this is the overarching theme with this legislation, and I'm not going to get too into it on just this specific part because there's more in this bill that I want to talk about. But the overarching theme is they are not addressing the systemic problems. All this is virtue signaling and trying to make it look like they're dealing with the problem that has people upset in the streets. And it's the same with this other provision in the bill that I'm going to talk about next. But banning chokeholds are not why people are in the street. People are not in the street because Officer Chauvin choked out George Floyd. People are in the streets because this is about I don't even know how many times we've seen police murder unarmed people on camera in broad daylight, and they don't give a shit that people are watching. They don't give a shit what they're doing. It's incredibly illegal and immoral. They just do it anyway because they're lawless and out of control. That's why people are in the streets. People aren't in the streets because of chokehold. So the idea that they're gonna pass this, put out this shitty legislation, and the whole big showpiece of it all is we're banning chokeholds on a national level. That's not going to get people out of the streets. That's not going to solve police brutality. So let me talk about another provision in this bill, which was the other big ticket item that they were putting in there, is they're going to end no-knock warrants for for cases involving nonviolent drug crimes. Okay, that's good, but like I said, that's not there's an entire systemic problem with policing in this country. It needs to be restructured radically. Banning no-knock warrants on drug arrest does not get to systemic problems with policing in this country. That is just nibbling around the edges. That is the textbook incrementalism that you'd expect from the Democratic Party. And again, this is just tokenism. This is just virtue signaling, and it's pretending like you're solving the problem because, hey, people are in the streets because not just George Floyd, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her house while the police were serving a no-knock warrant. And so they just busted up in her house and started shooting while she was asleep. Just busted up in her house and started shooting and murdered her. So obviously, if we ban no-knock warrants, people will get out of the streets. Like, no, the problem isn't just, again, that the police murdered this person in her home doing a no-knock warrant. People are mad and in the streets because this is, again, however many times we've seen the police bust up in some black person's house and just start shooting. Sometimes they're the ones who call the police. Sometimes there's another minor problem that may involve the police, and they just come into black residences and just start shooting recklessly. So banning no-knock warrants does not address a systemic problem of police just out of control firing on black people on contact as soon as they meet them. So again, there's systemic problems that aren't being addressed by this. This is just making it look like, oh, we see that you're upset about this, so let me just make sure that this one specific incident doesn't happen again. Some other shitty pieces. And again, like I said, if you included these things in any criminal justice reform, I wouldn't be against them. But for that to be the main goal of the legislation is comical. And it's especially infuriating because it's not like all of these things, like the policing system that we have in this country, it just appeared in nature. The out of control militarized police that we have, the Democrats they've propped them up this entire time. They've given them military equipment this entire time. They've allowed the police to act this out of control and murdering innocent people on the streets unprovoked, allowed this entire time, and there've been no pushback from them. And like Joe Biden and all these other corporate Democrats who've been around since the 90s, they were pushing these tough on crime legislations that criminalized and criminalized minor offenses that should have nothing to do with the police, giving the police the excuse that they need to harass black people. So whether it's the drug war, which they all supported, or qualified immunity protecting the police officers from prosecution and civil lawsuits, the Democrats have contributed to the gratuitously violent and out of control authoritarian police state that we have in this country right now. So the idea that they're going to put out these minor tweaks that don't do anything to restructure this broken system is insulting. And then of course you add on top the whole African garb kneeling in Emancipation Hall. It just adds to the level of disrespect in all of this. The bill would require body cams. Of course, I support that. Demilitarizing the police. So they're going around boasting about, oh yeah, this bill is going to demilitarize the police and all of that. No, it doesn't. what it does it specifically is now Congress isn't in the federal government. It would prevent them from giving local police any more military equipment like tanks and grenade launchers and all the other weapons of war that they do not need. That's good. Obviously, I support that. But there's no recognition that it was them who gave them these military equipment in the first place. And two, there is nothing in this bill that addresses the billions and billions of dollars worth of military equipment that these police departments already have. So I don't understand how you can say that this bill demilitarizes the police. Literally what it does, it says, okay, maybe this whole setup that we have where we give them tanks and grenade launchers and weapons of war, maybe we should just like kind of stop doing that. But whatever they have, I mean, feel free to use it against peaceful protesters and other innocent civilians on the street at your discretion. So it does not demilitarize the police. So I'm gonna need people to stop saying that that's what this bill does. And apparently there's a provision in there to limit qualified immunity. But from what I've heard and from what I've read, and from what I've heard Nancy Pelosi say about that part of the bill, it's unclear what they mean. And I don't know if they're going to go as far as necessary. So I might do a separate video about that. But I'd have to learn more about that specific provision to limit qualified immunity, which is what protects officers from being prosecuted a lot of time for their lawless behavior. And it also prevents people from suing them in civil court. Have a database for police misconduct. Yeah, I support that. Again, that doesn't restructure the entirely out of control police departments that we have in this country. And so it's just like a minor tweak. And so my take on this bill is, how on earth do you think this is going to deal with the out of control police that we have in this country? I read you the provisions that are in this bill. None of them address the fact that the police are literally out of control. It is chaos in this country. It is anarchy, because the people who are in charge of law enforcement are the most lawless people in the country right now. Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen entire police precincts and entire police departments assaulting peaceful protesters. Assault is illegal by itself. And you add on top of that these are peaceful protesters exercising the First Amendment. So we've seen entire police departments and precincts go to war against the Constitution and against the civilians that they're supposed to be protecting. That is a national crisis. That is a constitutional crisis. And what is the response from the corporate Democrats? What is the response from Congress, whose job it is to defend the Constitution and to protect the citizens of this country? What is their response to the fact that we've seen police officers brutalize people? And more than that, we've seen them lie brazenly on police reports, trying to make it seem like the protesters are the ones initiating violence. So it shows this, and it exposes a whole other problem of how untrustworthy the police are. These police officers, their same testimony has put millions of people behind bars, and like we've seen across the country, they will lie out their ass. It doesn't matter if they're on camera, caught brutalizing people. When they file their police reports, they'll say that they assaulted the officer first, and the officer responded in self-defense. That's what they're saying in thousands and thousands of these police reports across the country. So we have a crisis of legitimacy when it comes to law enforcement in this country. It's hard to make the case that they have any legitimate authority or that they should have a monopoly on violence the way they do when they're acting as out of control as they are. And it is a very thin line that we're walking right now between some form of social order and this complete anarchy, because people do not trust the police in this country. The police are out of control, violent, gratuitously violent, lawless thugs who selectively enforce the law when it's convenient for them. That is like I said, this is bringing a crisis of legitimacy for law enforcement and authority and government in this country in general. And that is a serious problem that needs to be addressed by lawmakers immediately. And what do? They put out this joke legislation to ban chokeholds and to end no-knock warrants for drug offenses. So if you really want to do structural reform and radical change of the way that policing is done in this country, there are policies that have been put out by Campaign Zero that have been pushed by many people on the left, and I've been talking about them on the show for a while. For me, above everything else, we need to have, on a national level, every single city in this country needs to have a community oversight board made up of members of the community, citizens, civilians in the community who have complete control and oversight of the police departments. Because we are allowing these lawless bunch of thugs to conduct investigations of themselves and determine when they are out of order and when they need to be prosecuted and when they should be fired. No, the citizens in the communities that they're policing should have a say in how the police departments are run. And if they did, it would drastically limit the lawlessness that we're seeing from police departments across the country. Because as soon as they get up and are out of order, the community could step in and correct that shit. And we don't have to wait for national legislation. We don't have to wait for a mayor or a governor to take action. The communities in these cities should be able to should have control over the police departments. So that is my number one priority when it comes to radically reforming policing in this country. Another thing that would be a huge game changer in policing, and the drug war. I can't even hear anybody making a logical argument as to why the police and the federal government should be spending billions and billions of dollars a year to enforce drug laws, mostly for marijuana offenses, and create this atmosphere of a constant state of war between the police departments and their citizens over a non-violent offense like drug use. So ending the drug war, it drastically cuts down the excuses that the police have to harass black and poor people in this country for drug use. Even though rich white people use drugs at the same rate, its own drug laws are only enforced on poor black people. So if you want to do something about a racist police system, if you want to do something about police brutality, end the drug war. In instances where there's police violence, police brutality, instead of having internal affairs investigated, instead of the case being handled by prosecutors at the district attorney's office who work with these very same police officers every single day, instead of having it handled internally, there needs to be independent, external body investigating these instances of police misconduct, police abuse, and police brutality, whether it's independent state attorney generals who are given this authority, or if it's the federal government. But I don't know what it is, but there needs to be independent investigation and prosecution in cases of police brutality. And I would include the hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of videos of entire police departments assaulting peaceful protesters. That should also be under their purview, and all of them should be arrested and prosecuted. Anybody who participated in assaulting protesters or stood by and watched as other police officers assaulted protesters, they should all be arrested and prosecuted. This one is just something I thought about I've been thinking about since the other day. Haven't really heard anybody talk about this, but since there's this huge call to defund the police across the country, why not make it so that the federal government, any city that decides to reallocate money from the police department in their city to fund social programs, the federal government should match that dollar for dollar. So if you take $1 million from a city police department and you put that $1 million to social programs, the federal government should match that $1 million in funding to social programs. And that would incentivize local cities to invest in their community as opposed to spending endless amounts of money on law enforcement to control by force and aggressively, violently police these communities. So there are a bunch of good ideas from a lot of people out there that would radically restructure policing in this country. And of course, none of them are in this bill. This is just window dressing and theater to make it look like they're doing something. And this is just a typical move you'd expect from corporate Democrats. They know the Republicans aren't going to do anything better. They know the Republicans don't really give a shit about this issue. So they offer you policy that doesn't even solve 10% of the problem, and they expect you to just take it and shut the fuck up and don't complain and don't say anything about it. Well, we'll see how well that works, because from what I can tell, activists on the streets, protesters, they aren't buying this shit. This shit is not getting them out the streets, and that's my final point. That's the main reason here. Nancy Pelosi doesn't give a shit about Black Lives Matter. She's been asked about this a bunch of times since the movement started, and she's been indifferent to them this entire time. In fact, there was a memo leaked in the WikiLeaks of Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership sending a memo to other members of Congress telling them to not offer policy solutions to Black Lives Matter activists. So Nancy Pelosi doesn't care about solving police brutality. They've been out of control for decades. Nancy Pelosi's been in Democratic leadership for decades at this point. And she's been in power for even longer. She has done nothing about this issue. She's not brought attention to this issue. She's introduced any legislation on this issue because she doesn't care. And so they put out this steaming pile of shit and expect everybody to embrace it and be grateful for it, when really all she's doing is trying to say, okay guys, enough. We hear you. Here's this joke legislation. Now get the fuck out of the streets and go back in your houses and just be done with all this protesting against the police and all this stuff. That's what she's really doing. And she knows that it'll pass to the House, no problem, because Democrats have the majority. But she knows it's dead on arrival when it gets to the Senate. And the Democrats will not put up any kind of fight. I will bet my bottom dollar, because maybe they will. I don't know. But from what I've seen and what I know of these corporate Democrats, they won't put up any kind of fight against the Republicans to get this passed, because they never do. They never do. No matter how pressing the issue is, no matter how existential the issue is, they never put up a fight against the Republicans to get left-wing policies through. So this will be no different. They know it's dead on arrival, but she's putting on a show. She's putting on a show, and that's exactly what this is. So I hope nobody's out there buying it. And from what it looks like, nobody is.